Hey, Zerm listeners, this is part 7 in my following of the news story about Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt. Let's watch some clips and then I will talk.
Because the truth is, in this case, in this culture, it's the Mormon church that sets up the rules. And the rules are, for decades, if not centuries, well, at least for 50 years, the Mormon church typically has discouraged its members from seeking licensed mental health professionals.
Okay, so we are watching the Mormon Stories podcast, which has been producing excellent content regarding this story and others. And I want to give a huge thank you to a YouTube commenter by the name of Lehu. Their real name is Aaliyah, and they provided a lot of clips that I could watch, because this interview is 3 hours long, but Lehu/Aaliyah provided very specific clips that I'm going to watch and comment on. So right here, what they're talking about is Jodi Hildebrandt having been for decades a practicing therapist, even though there were signs and allegations and accounts of her abusing children and promoting abuse of children. And how could that happen, right? So there's going to be a lot of discussion along those lines. And I have a lot of experience within different areas within this discussion as to whether or not Jodi Hildebrandt should have had her license taken away, because I've been a therapist myself for 27 years. I have been a trainer of therapists, a professor, and a supervisor, not only within the university, but also therapists that are working in the field. I have taught ethics and legal matters to my students and supervised that. I have had the opportunity to talk on this YouTube channel often about it. It gives me a chance to look into all these legal cases. I have been asked to be an expert witness or provide consultation for people who are being accused of an ethical violation or clients who are accusing their therapist of an ethical violation. And I have colleagues who work in courts regarding this. So, I have a fair amount of expertise on this. So what they're talking about on the Mormon Stories podcast, as alerted to me by Lehu/Aaliyah, is that what they're talking about right now is, what systems allow Jodi Hildebrandt to be able to practice for so long without any sort of meaningful, helpful oversight, is what they're getting into.
And instead is just encourage people to pray and fast and read their scriptures and maybe talk to your bishop.
Right. So what he's saying is that in the, more traditionally, and when we talk about Mormons or the Mormon Church or Latter-day Saints, we're talking about millions and millions of people that span the globe in hundreds of different cultures and languages. So it's hard to generalize. And I have had a lot of people in my life and clients who were Mormon, and I've heard varying accounts. I've heard on one end of the spectrum, Mormons who seemingly are not in a cult, and it's a very positive thing in their life. They have the freedom to leave, perhaps, or to question the faith. So you have people on that end of the spectrum that I have known in my life. I grew up with a fair amount of Mormons. I don't know exactly why. East of Seattle is where I grew up, Bellevue, Issaquah, that kind of region, and there's a fair amount of Mormons out there. I don't know but anyway, so on that end of the spectrum, and then on the other end of the spectrum, I've absolutely worked with clients and have heard accounts from people who, within the Mormon faith, were absolutely in a high control group and were abused in a variety of ways. Families just completely split apart because one member just decides that they want to question the Mormon doctrine. And there's a lot of patriarchy and racism within the traditions of the Mormon Church. So, I just want to say that up front. But what he's saying is that traditionally, often within the Mormon Church, they will discourage their members from going in to see a therapist outside of the church, because it's such an intimate relationship with a therapist, and there's a lot of potential influence. And at least it's a stereotype that therapists are not necessarily religious. They might even be considered by religious people like Mormon individuals, they might consider us to be of the devil because we don't talk about religion, or we give people the freedom or There might even be this notion that because we follow science and we talk about the freedom to choose and those kinds of things, that we're actually anti-religion, not only just neutral about religion, but anti. And what I'll say is that there's a wide variety of therapists. There are Mormon therapists who are ethical. There are Mormon therapists who are unethical. There are secular therapists that are ethical, and there are secular therapists that are unethical. It varies. But the problem is that when you have a high control group, a cult, that denies its members the ability to seek outside advice, then you as a cult have total control over the narrative. When you do that, you're privileging a set of therapists, not because they're better, but because they adhere to your point of view of religion, because you're afraid of the outside world. That's what cults do. They make everyone afraid of the outside group. They're very concerned about the out group, and they're very concerned about the in group. There aren't those normal checks and balances. And so when you have that insular culture, it raises the risk a lot for a bad actor to be able to abuse all sorts of people.
Now, we know through the research that people from all religious backgrounds do prefer a therapist that comes from their own religious background, usually. There's been a long history between the field of psychotherapy and religion being somewhat controversial and somewhat conflictual. And that makes sense because a lot of the principles that have to do with psychology are about self-determination. And a lot of the principles that have to do with religion have to do with community and external authority.
It's weird. It's sort of a both and, in that in my anecdotal experience in my neck of the woods, I have seen almost an overemphasis of religion being within psychotherapy. For example, in the Seattle area, off the top of my head, most of the training programs, the universities, the colleges that train therapists are religious, are Christian. You have Seattle Pacific, which is considered to be, I guess, evangelical or contemporary Christian. South of Seattle, in Tacoma, I believe, there's a Lutheran university that trains therapists, or at least they used to. With Seattle Pacific, there was a controversy that the university was forcing the professors to sign a pledge that they believed being gay was a sin, or something like that. So imagine that you're being trained as a therapist in Seattle, one of the most liberal places, and frankly, one of the most non-religious places. Not that religion is bad. Imagine that in Seattle, that you have a university that is well respected and training a lot of clinicians, that the professors have to sign a pledge saying that they believe. I don't know the exact pledge, but it was seen by people that were criticizing it as basically a homophobic pledge. In today's day and age, it's just abhorrent. We understand that homophobia exists, but in a university, one, and two, in a Seattle university, and three, in a university that trains therapists, it's pretty awful. And I also want to say, as I've said before, I have worked alongside, I've even supervised therapists who consider themselves to be Christian counselors or Christian therapists. And we talked a lot about how they could integrate Christianity into their practice in an ethical way, and how they can advertise themselves as such, and how they can still honor the autonomy of the client. So there's a lot of variety is the point. So on one hand, religion has always been very much overlapping with psychotherapy and psychology. But on the other hand, as she is getting at, I believe her name is Natasha Helfer, that it has been in opposition for some obvious reasons. What she's identifying is interesting. I don't think I've ever heard it that way, but it makes sense that in therapy and in psychology, we tend to value individual autonomy to make your own life, to decide who you are, to make your own choices, and to decide for yourself what sort of moral values that you want to follow. And traditionally within religion, it's the opposite, right? So those things are in opposition. But to me, they don't have to be. And the Christian counselors that I supervised, they certainly didn't impose some sort of notion on their clients regarding that.
50s, 1960s, we had plenty of ecclesiastical leaders, including those from the LDS Church, that basically said psychiatry was evil. It was an evil thing. Do not go to a psychiatrist, because really the field of psychiatry came before this field of psychology as far as like the literature and all of that is.
Yeah, it's a very common thing, not only within religious groups, but just in the general public. There's a suspicion or anxiety about having medications infect your brain, which, yeah, we should be careful, and we should not overdiagnose or overdepend on medications when other treatments might be safer and more effective, long term. But to just write off the entire field of psychiatry is just mind-boggling. It's similar when people say, it's like a flat earth or that climate change isn't real. It's like, so you have, it's a very robust discipline within biology and science and medicine that has been going strong and doing a lot of really great work for 100 years plus. And to just say, yeah, the whole thing. And so, you remember seeing this with Tom Cruise and Scientology. Yeah, there's just something scary to cultish organizations that it's like, ooh, there's this powerful group who could influence our members. We don't want that. And also, I think it challenges their doctrine often that, well, God can fix you. You don't need any other thing. God has all the answers, or our system has all the answers. And since we can't prescribe medications, we can't provide that service to you. It must not be valid, or it is a competitor for your allegiance. It's weird to think that they would think that if you have allegiance to psychiatry, that somehow that would diminish the allegiance to the religion. I mean, the two can absolutely coexist, right?
What are the types of things that would get a Mormon therapist off the LDS Family Services list?
Well, for me, it was the blog post that I did in 2012 where I talked about masturbation being normative sexual behavior. It's different to have values against masturbation, but to also know that it's considered clinically normative behavior.
And that's very well put, the way that she puts it, that scientifically, there's nothing wrong with masturbation. As long as it's not harmful to people, as long as it's not part of a compulsion or an addiction, then it's fine. There's a lot of positives that come from it. You don't have to do it, but if you are doing it, it's fine. But it's also fine if, as a part of your religion, that you believe that it's a sin or wrong, or it's not good for your marriage. You can have that point of view for yourself. It's not wrong to not masturbate. It's not immoral to not masturbate. It's just a personal choice that you make. But for the Mormon Church, apparently, it was wrong not only for their members, but it's just wrong. The whole thing is wrong. And any therapist who suggests otherwise will be labeled as someone that is unsafe or not good or not worthy of us sending clients to.
You should, as a therapist, be able to hold those two realities. Many therapists cannot. And that's what gets us in trouble. We've all been through the same trainings. Every single program out there, whatever program Jodi Hildebrandt went to become a licensed therapist, she had to take ethics. And all of us have to take ethical training 3 hours every 3 years for the rest of our careers. That's all of us. Yeah,
every state, I believe, has its own requirement. In Washington, it's actually more than that, but it's not enough. I've had a lot of classes and continuing education on ethics, and they certainly have helped, these courses. But to really understand ethics and the law, I have had to spend a lot of time, really, on this podcast. People will ask me questions, and because I have the privilege of people being members, paying members, I can actually spend my work week actually investigating personally, just to kind of get my head around these things so I can talk about it with competence when I am speaking publicly. And in that process of many, many hours and talking with legal experts and all sorts of people, it's started to click rather recently, maybe in the last 7 years or something. And this is after I had had 2 masters and a doctorate with all sorts of ethics. And I was teaching ethics, at least I was teaching ethical concepts to my students. And it was sort of late in the game. It's hard, it's complicated. And the way that we teach ethics is, in my opinion, not optimal. There's a better way to accelerate that, in my opinion. And so, what she's saying is we all come from the same system. Jodi Hildebrandt got her degree in a regular accredited program in all likelihood. I'm just going to take a guess and say that happened. There wouldn't be any reason to believe that didn't happen. And yet, even though we have that training, not everyone follows it or understands it.
And what other positions would get someone off the list?
Well, the reasons I got excommunicated from the church was I supported gay marriage. The other reason is because
What about just being LGBTQ affirming?
Well, I haven't necessarily seen that necessarily explicitly stated as being off the list, but that's going to flag you. And what does that mean?
I mean, it's just incredible. We're not talking about Westboro Baptist Church. If you're not familiar, it's a tiny little cult that is super homophobic. I mean, just over the top. I think the congregation has a few dozen people, maybe more, but it's this tiny little group of people that have a very loud voice. We're not talking about that. We're talking about millions and millions of people who are integrated within our society. They're living right next door to us. And they believe that masturbation or being bisexual or trans is wrong, immoral, a sin against God. It's just incredible. And they do so much to try to push us back into the Stone Age about this. I don't want to denigrate the Stone Age. They probably weren't as homophobic as these people are today. They want to. I don't know what they're trying to do. They're just hateful bigots who have this completely illogical. I just don't understand it in 2023 that you could still have this point of view in the United States. With the internet, with everything that is available to you. 30 years ago, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have a lot of contact with things. Gay people weren't necessarily on television very much as characters. I remember there was a gay character played by Billy Crystal in Soap as a kid. I remember that was revolutionary in like the late 70s. I don't know if that holds up today, but point is that back then there weren't a lot of opportunities to stretch your mind. Today, I mean, I just wish we could force all these folks, like in Clockwork Orange, you hold their eyelids open and you force them to watch just like 3 episodes of Queer Eye. And it just shoots them in the foot. It makes them irrelevant. If they just adjusted like a lot of other churches do, they wouldn't be in such opposition with reality and the rest of the society. But of course, the reason for this, in my estimation, is because they need to establish an in-group and an out-group, and this is one of the ways that they can do that. If they fear-monger, right, and they just say, they're trying to have sex with all of our kids, and they have all that mentality and that paranoia, then it just makes them more insular, and it makes the charismatic leaders more powerful because they have more control over the members. It could have been anything. There just has to be something that demarcates between us and them, and that detail, that idea of being pro-gay marriage or anti-gay marriage is, I guess, what they decided to land on, right? And it's mind-boggling. And like I said, if it was a small little group and I'm waking up, I knew that these elements were in my country, but I did not know how prevalent it was. Religion is going down, but fundamentalism is going up. And I don't think I saw that. I knew religion was going down, but I thought that fundamentalism would also be going down, but it's the opposite. There are much more fundamentalist Christians in the United States than there ever have been. And that's terrifying. That we live in a group and I live in a country that's supposedly about freedom and progressing forward and social justice. That is what we were founded upon and what we've continued to bend the arc of justice towards. And yet we have this rise of this very powerful, very frothing at the mouth group of people that are insane. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're all just echo chambering each other into this frenzy, and it's terrifying. Will it ever go down, or will it continue to get worse? And when we have that, then we have cases like the Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, where they, in my estimation, were allowed not only to proliferate, because there are many more, you make no doubt about it. I have heard so many accounts and read so many news stories. Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke are one of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of charismatic leaders and parents who are in this camp of promoting the abuse of children. It's a point of pride to them. It's a cult within a cult that comprises of many cults. It's not just Mormons, but it's the IBLP and the evangelicals and maybe even other religions. I don't know. But it's this movement to abuse children and to make parenting great again. And it's happening all the time. And we need to do something about it. And a part of that is that our regulating bodies, not only of child mistreatment and child welfare, like Child Protective Services, but also the licensing board, like when the licensing board goes after Jordan Peterson, these organizations need to be stronger, not weaker. They need more tax dollars. They need more leeway to monitor and do things. That's the answer that I think. Okay, well, that does it for that episode. I want everyone to take care of themselves, really. I always say it, but it's even more important this time because of the material that we're watching. And everyone, please take care of yourself, truly, because you deserve it. You really, really do.